Okay, so good morning. Today we're going to look at the other trend that happens early in the Baroque period. We've seen Caravaggio, but at the same time, Caravaggio starts his really very revolutionary style. We have also a far more classical trend, which is with the Carracci. And both of them will have their followers, and we'll see that both of them are going to be very influential. So, as they are from Bologna, let's have a little idea of what Bologna is about. Bologna is in the northern part of Italy, still south of Verona, but a really very important center of European intellectual life. And one of the very big reasons is that in 1088 was founded the University of Bologna, which was the oldest university in Europe. So automatically, when you have that very influential university, you have all kinds of scholars that come in, and that creates that elite, intellectual elite that lived there. So really became an important center in Europe. From 1506 to 1796, it became part of the Papal States continuously. It was prior to 1506. It was already supposed to be part of the Papal States, but the ruler that was taking care of that city-state became a little too greedy and tried to separate himself from the power of the Pope. And finally, Julius II, the famous Pope that worked with Michelangelo, the warrior Pope, as he was called, came at the head of his army and put Bologna back into under his ruling. That was very controversial for the Bolognese, because at that time he ordered Michelangelo to make a statue of his that was going to be on the facade, put on the facade of the main church in Bologna. And as soon as he left, a couple of years later, the Bolognese very quickly took that bust that was made, by the way, in bronze and melted it to make it a cannon. And that was to actually fight the Pope again. But anyway, it remained there. Following the takeover by Julius II, there was a very large movement of construction of churches, as well as the restoration of other ones. But Bologna was known to have 96 convents just in that city. Don't compare it to modern Bologna. It was not that big. It was about the sixth city in Europe. But 96 convents is an enormous amount when you think about it. It was also important enough that in 1530, the Emperor Charles V was crowned in the city. And he was the last of the Holy Roman Emperor to be crowned by the Pope. Just to locate more or less the Carracci on the timeline, and I left on the upper part, as you can see, different painters that were very influential on them. When they founded the Academy, we'll go a little more into it, they were very much influenced by all these painters, and that includes Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and Tintoretto. And as you can see, Caravaggio at the very bottom line is totally contemporary with them. And he's going to actually, at least in one of the church, work side by side with Carracci, who was given the altarpiece, and he was given the two side paintings. I always love these timelines. I think it's really nice to give us a feel for when it took place. As you can see, Agostino didn't live very, very long, but definitely Caravaggio is the one who had the shortest lifetime. So the Carracci family Mostly what we know of them comes from two biographers, Malvasia and Bellori. Bellori, that is going to be pretty much the art historian of the time. But because they are so, these biographers are so chauvinistic, if you want, to the city they come from, they always show a big bias towards painters that come from other cities. So we'll find we have to discriminate when, you know, be very critical of when we see, read these biographies of the actual attitude of the biographer towards the painter. At first, they start working in a common studio, and then we'll see that their life is going to take separate.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a few online people who can't get in because the meeting has been blocked.
Meeting has been blocked. I haven't done any.
They said they tried to get in, but that you blocked the meeting and they can't get in.
I don't know how I can open that.
Maybe if there's a request to join.
Let me see. I'm muted, that's all. But I don't see any. I have 7 people.
So far, is Cynthia waiting on them?
Who?
Cynthia waiting?
Yeah, she was.
She stopped, yeah, she's trying to get back in, but she said she can't get back in. So.
Oh gosh, I really don't know. Apologize. Let me see if I can invite her. It doesn't show. Invite. Let me see. Okay, unlock meeting. It was locked, but not my fault. You're welcome. Okay, sorry for that interruption. So when we look at the 3 artists, Ludovico is the cousin, and Agostino and Annibale are brothers. The 3 of them are going to be very much involved in the new academy that they will found. The academy that was founded in Bologna, that at first was called the Academy of the Desiderosi, which means the one that are desirous of fame and learning. And that very quickly the name was turned into Incaminati, which means the Academy of the Progressives. So it was founded in the early years of 1580, and it very soon became a center for progressive art. It attracted not only artists, but it attracted nobility, university people, scholars, musical people, literary and theatrical work. So it became a very much of the principle, you know, that we find in Germany later on in the 18th, 19th century, where you have a whole series of arts that are represented. It put a special emphasis on drawing from life and very much a renewed observation of nature, where they really looked at nature and didn't just invent, but looked at it and used it as the example. So doing what we call verisimilitude. It also started studying the regional convention of art. So looking at the different areas, and when we see the centers, we can think of Milan, Venice, Mantua for a while, Florence, and Rome. And later on, many of these artists are going to go to Naples, but by that time, there was no particular school in Naples. And so they, in fact, made a real symbiosis of many of the styles that were around. Instead of just fixing themselves on one school, like the Roman school or the Florentine school, they took the best of everything and tried to make it a new style. They studied particularly perspective drawings, and use the chiaroscuro to express space. So it's through the shadows and the lights that really they gave a good idea of space. And they created figures either by memory or by description, though they emphasized the idea of looking at a model when they were painting to make sure the anatomy was correct. Most of people that were working by memory were actually the mannerists. And they started distancing themselves from mannerism, where in mannerism, they would look at a piece of art and they would take, for example, one little part of that piece of art and integrating that part into their own painting. It produced an enormous amount of great painters that became very successful. And I only give you a few names, but Guido Reni, Domenichino, Massari, Guercino, and Franco are only a few of the names that were produced by that academy. So Ludovico Carracci, the older one, is the cousin, was born in 1555 in Bologna, apprenticed under Prospero Fontana, who became, by the way, the master of the three Carracci. They all went through him. By 1585, Ludovico and his cousins had founded the Eclectic Academy of Painting, and he did a lot of traveling. He went to Florence, Parma, and Venice before returning to Bologna. He is the only one that didn't go to Rome. And he died in Bologna in 1619. He produced some absolutely wonderful works of art. And there you can see, and I'm only showing you really a selection, but you can see directly the influence of painters like Titian with him, particularly in this work, the Bargellini Madonna, that is really characterized by that very strong mood and broad gesture, as you can see. And this is quite inspired by the Titian, the Pesaro Madonna. As you can see, there is a similar movement, but it gives it a more aerial feeling. You do have a beautiful sky. The light is more intense. And what they try to do, what they move from, is the exaggerated mannerism of the figures at the end of the Renaissance, and now giving it a very much more natural, but very powerful. Don't forget that they respond, the three of the family respond to the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation that was inciting the artists to appeal to the emotions. And so this is very much what they try to do, make it a rather clear message.
Are you still muted?
Yes.
So people online can't hear you.
They can't hear me.
Because you're muted.
Okay, I shouldn't be muting myself, but let me see if I can find here. I'm supposed to be okay. Am I speaking? Yeah, they should hear me.
Oh, thank you.
I see the microphone working. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see with these two paintings, there's definitely an influence. You know that Ludovico has been watching the works by Titian, and particularly the Pesaro Madonna. But on the other hand, he brings the figures closer to the surface of the painting. You have eye contact. Look at, it's really interesting. Or here you can see that same, and I don't think it could be Saint Dominic, but kind of looking at you, kind of saying, you know, you should pray with me to the Virgin. And that's the whole mood thing that Ludovico is bringing in most of the Carraccis. You can also see that they follow the works of Titian with very saturated color, beautiful color scheme. in the Dream of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Very interesting painting. It's the first time that Catherine that you see on the left is asleep. And it's really a vision, a dream that she's going through at that time. You can see just a little piece of the famous veil that was broken by the angel to identify her as Catherine, while Jesus is kind of moving towards her, held very gently by the Virgin. Can you see? Where are you going? Okay. Thank you. So that's really that representation of that dream where Jesus is now moving towards Catherine and is going to give her the ring that's going to bind her to him by that mystic marriage that she's so known for. Then you have two angels at the back. This is, by the way, when you look at it, much more influences by Correggio. And that's sfumato that he himself had inherited from Leonardo da Vinci. You have that beautiful soft atmosphere that based all the figures. But the intense red is very much what's going to become the red of Baroque, where you have that very strong saturation. But the very beautiful image of Catherine there, that is kind of surrounded by these beautiful folds of her garment. It's quite special and really a first in the treatment of that theme. Ludovico goes on doing different of these commissions. In this case, he's influenced by both Tintoretto and we'll see that kind of mysticism reflected in the works of Bernini when they come later on. So who was Hyacinth? He was actually originally from Upper Silesia, close to Krakow in Poland, but was educated in Paris and Bologna. He became a doctor of sacred studies and a priest, and he traveled to reform convents in Poland. He came to Rome and then witnessed a miracle performed by Saint Dominic and became a Dominican. He brought the Dominican order to Poland and then evangelized to the whole region. During an attack on a monastery, he managed to save a monstrance. You know, it's where you put the host, and this is where the host is shown on the altar. He saved that monstrance, and that was containing the Blessed Sacrament, as well as a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary that was much bigger than normally a human could carry, but by a miracle he was able to save it. And this became really the two symbols that accompany him most of the time, is a monstrance as well as a statue. Again, you have quite a beautiful atmosphere, and you can see in his work, and you will see with the others, you can look at it and you say, oh, that looks very much like Titian, but that's Correggio. You know, you can really see some works are closer to Raphael, but it's really the kind of symbiosis of the whole thing. The cousin, the elder of the two cousins, Agostino Carracci, was also born in Bologna, was initially trained as a goldsmith, and as you can see in that self-portrait, he portrays himself as a watchmaker, which is interesting. Starting from 1574, he's going to become of the three cousins, the most famous engraver. He will meet the Flemish engraver Cornelis Cort in Venice, and he's going to study with him. And he is going to become one of the most famous engraver of his time. He copied, thanks to that, the work of Barocquue, Tintoretto, Campi, Veronese, and Correggio, as well as Titian. And thanks to him, there are works that have disappeared that we still know through the engravings. Now think engravings, it's a sheet of paper. It's much cheaper than a painting. You can sell it and it travels. And this is a time, and it had started earlier, of course, but this is really a time where all these works are going to travel all over Europe and end up in the most important workshops in Europe and facilitate the way artists are, the awareness about of other artists, of the styles, the trends that happen somewhere else. And we come to a time where we almost have a unification of styles, thanks to the Carracci, because they bring that experience to everybody in a much easier way. He went to Venice and partly to meet Cornelis Cort and see the city that was so beautiful. And so in 1582, and then from 1587 to 89, he stayed in Venice. Traveled to Parma to study the works of Correggio in 1586 and 87, and then was called back to Parma in 1599 to work there, but his health went downhill, unfortunately, and he died in Parma in 1602. He was a painter, printmaker, tapestry designer, and art teacher. And I have some interesting little histories here. The painting that you see there is mine. But it's really interesting that when I bought it, I found it in an auction in Chicago. And I saw it and it was kind of thrown on a seat. And I go there and I say, oh my gosh, that's Titian. You know, you can recognize it's a self-portrait by Titian. And really beautifully painted, but it's on a student board. It's not on a canvas, it's not on a panel, it's on one of these student boards. So I started looking for that. I wanted to know more about that particular self-portrait and found out that it was derived from this engraving by Carracci of one of the first self-portraits made by Titian, but that had disappeared in a fire. So the original was burned just after Carracci made that engraving. And the only thing I can imagine is that a very talented student of art saw that story, saw that engraving, and reconstructed the painting, basing himself, as far as colors, on other existing self-portrait by Titian, where he often wears a similar coat with the fur collar and everything. And so it ended up next to me in my office because I absolutely love it. And so it's just next to me, and every time I look at it, I thank Carracci for having done that engraving from which this painting was copied. And it's really a lovely piece of art. So, but just to give you an idea how things can happen. So these are these funny side stories. As I mentioned, he copied works. For example, this is the huge Crucifixion by Tintoretto in the Sala dell'Albergo in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice. It's an enormous work. And Carracci copied it as an engraving. So you can imagine that already the sheer size of that work. So you needed a piece of paper that could accommodate that. He did the same for Veronese, but if you look well side by side, you can see that there are discrepancies. And what we call the way that he often copied works, it was a critical copy. When he found things he didn't care for, he would change it. And it's very interesting. Look at the difference. For example, there is an open book there on the pedestal. He got rid of it. He thought it was unnecessary and cumbersome. As you can see, he's going to change the attitude here compared to this. This is to him probably too human to be so close to the Virgin. So he gives it a much more forceful character just next to the Virgin. He's also changing the perspective. You see on this, he realized it was not a proper perspective. And as he was a specialist in perspective, he's going to correct it and make it the way it should look. So really interesting happening with his works. The three cousins were fabulous graphic art artists. And this is an example by Agostino of a rectal drawing of that woman who is partially blind. It's absolutely superb when you see that face. To me, it makes me think of Rubens, because Rubens was drawing in a very similar way and probably influenced by the Carracci. Don't forget that by the time, I don't have a date on this one, but Rubens arrives in Italy in 1600. So he's going to be exposed to the contemporary works of the Carracci as well as Caravaggio. He stays about 9 years in Italy at that time, in Mantua, which is not too far from Bologna. So most probably he had quite a bit of contact with them. But this is just a beautiful way of very softly accentuating the shadow and the light in the face. I think it's a very powerful portrait. Some of his works, the Madonna Con Bambini e Santi, so the Madonna with the baby and saints. Influence, you can see here, it's very much a Correggio, just even the type of figures, but then very lively movement. You have that young child and the foot. Probably should be John the Baptist, because he's wearing that skin over his shoulder, who's showing his cousin Jesus on the laps of Mary. And Mary is very beautiful. She's nursing him. He's drinking. He's very busy there. But you can see that kind of very human attitude of the Virgin, very motherly attitude of her. He made a few lamentations also that were all very influential. All their works at that time were very influential. Not just the beauty of the red again, we have that very strongly saturated red, and the pain of Mary, Mary Magdalene, who is trying to take some of the oil to bless Jesus. And then the pain of St. John, who's touching Christ, who's there. And a pretty, just a little landscape in the background with very beautiful light. The Communion of St. Girolamo, very different color scheme, much softer. But again, we have the nice arch, the architecture there at the back, proper perspective. But St. Girolamo, they're given the communion, as you can see, and then some exotic figures with turbans participating to the crowd. The Penitent Magdalene, that is one of the big paintings. Titian did many, but Agostino did a couple, and so will Annibale. showing Mary in penance, it's the time where she was a hermit. But that's, I don't know who's. That's a time where Mary retired in the wilderness, and according to the sacred legends of Borromini, the golden legends, she was only dressed with her hair, and her hair was the thing. So here, Carracci is helping her a little bit by putting some lovely clothes. Yes.
What is the meaning of the skull?
The skull is the idea of penance. It's that idea of meditating on the fact that we are only a transition on the earth, and that death is at the end, and beyond death, we should have salvation if we behave properly. So often you see Saint Jerome or Mary Magdalene or any other saint that is in meditation, they will always have a skull. Some not more interesting, but some very interesting works is, for example, this one of the portraits of Arrigo Peloso, Pietro Matto, and Amon Main. Was at first misidentified as an allegorical or mythological work. And then they realized they were able to identify each of the figures, and they realized, in fact, it was a triple portrait. So the person that you see with the hairy face, Arrigo, is a sufferer from hypertrichosis. Then you have the head of Pietro Matto, or Mad Peter, on the top right. So he was known for being insane. And then you have on the left the dwarf Ammon with a parrot on his shoulder and a dog under his right arm. That was probably a jouster for one of the rulers in Bologna. The hairy men were quite something that attracted people. It was part of these diseases that somebody, or not really a disease, but condition that people were suffering from. And very often you see in that century, in the 17th century, you see a lot of portraits of these hairy men or hairy women. It can be either one. They were actually, and we'll see that both Annibale and Agostino were asked by the ruler in Bologna to paint a whole room with the name of the room was the San Adamonte. So anything that had to do with love, and typically these were loves in antiquity. So the loves of Zeus and love of others. This is Venus and Mars, surrounded by other lovers. So we'll take a little break before we move to Annibale Carracci. And if people there, I'm sorry again for all the problems we encountered. Want to unmute yourself? I'll mute you afterwards. So please, no music, please. Otherwise I have to mute you again. Somebody is playing jazz, and it's
sorry, it's me.
Okay.
Apologize.
One of those I think myself sometimes, I'm not a artist, but we sing flaws in a lot of these.
Yes.
For this one, he used like this, a number of his paintings, and one with this woman's holding a hammer up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a wrong perspective. It tried to do a foreshortening. It might be early because they became really specialists yeah. But you find at the beginning they still are very much influenced by mannerism, and then they really move away from it. And these discrepancies are because of mannerism, the mannerist style. And the question.
And if I may. just a curiosity. I was, before the session, I was reading about the Carracci family. I was impressed by the amount of work done with the Greek mythology.
Yes.
Tremendous amount. And also in the academy, the emphasis on teaching people the Greek classics. I mean, it was just amazing that these people were so focused in still. I mean,
Okay, hold on a second so I can repeat it for those that didn't hear. John is talking about the fact that he is amazed how many works were still based on Greek mythology. And what we will see, the main work of Annibale with the Palazzo Farnese is all based on Greek mythology. The Greek mythology was a source of incredible inspiration. You had the Bible on one side and you had mythology on the other. And when you wanted to step away from the Bible, the only thing that you could work on was typically Greek mythology. You had all kind of different kind of loves and disaster, and so it was quite entertaining. We will see that the Counter-Reformation is going to try to push that away, but they had nothing to say for private houses. They could say something for what is in the church. And the Carracci are going to respond to the demands of some patrons, and we'll see the main work with the Palazzo Farnese belonged to a cardinal, and he is going to have that incredible ceiling with the love of Bacchus and Ariadne, but surrounded by other scenes of love. So I think your statement is really interesting because it was that ambiguity that you find during that period of time, where normally you should set your eyes on things that are a little wiser and calmer and more, in order with the Counter-Reformation, but they wanted to be entertained. I didn't show you a lot of what Raphael had done before, but of course, Raphael comes the Counter-Reformation hasn't hit them yet, though it happens just before he dies. But he makes some very erotic paintings in some of the palaces. So this is just a continuation of a source of inspiration that you will find used, mostly starting, Botticelli and so on, did all these works that were inspired by the mythology.
thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Perfect. I mean, I never thought about the issue, the Bible or the Greeks. I mean,
yeah, exactly. You find occasionally some works that are inspired by some medieval writings. And then it's always courtly, and it's how a woman is in love with a knight who is not her husband, and he tries to resist, but then she's angry and she tells bad things to her husband about that knight, and he gets killed, and then she's punished. And so you have these very complicated, plays. And these sometimes I have in my head, there's a palace in Florence that has that type of decoration in the bedroom. But the most current is definitely mythology. Listen, if you read the mythology, it's a non-ending story of love and death, and you have everything. Don't forget, mythology was a reflection of the human being's defects and qualities. So we find ourselves in that. Any other question?
Not a question, but I think we should all go see the Last Duel. This film is out about 2 nights, and just what you were saying, it's directed by Ridley Scott. So
I think I heard of that.
Right.
I did, yeah.
But it's supposed to be an update in that the wife who is bartered between these 2 knights is a 21st century woman who causes a great fuss and resists being sold off or
Yeah.
turned over
So
to the younger ones. part of the movie from Winning the Fight.
Yeah, Frances is talking that we should go and look at the movie, The Last
The
Duel.
Last Duel.
The Last Duel that deals with the same type of history, but kind of puts in more contemporary terms.
Right.
Yeah.
A twist.
Yeah, you know, now it takes different slants, but it's a renewal. It's always the same. Look at some of the stories that are well hidden. And then when you suddenly open the box of Pandora and you see what really happens in these places, it's worse than mythology. You know, mythology, we have to realize people like Hercules was based on the real person that was stronger and taller than others and did good and bad things. And then with time, with the tradition, he became a hero. But he was probably kind of a slightly different, more impressive type of character. And then with oral tradition, grew and grew and grew as that incredible semi-god character. So this is where we go. Okay, if we can take care of the lights, I'm going to mute you again and we can talk at the end. No, that's not what I want. Here we are. Okay, so the third of the cousins, Annibale Carracci, the youngest of the three of them, born in Bologna in 1560, found the Academy with the other two in their dates differ. So I say early 1580s. Traveled to Parma and Venice in 1587-88. And imagine for an artist this being a direct witness of all the art that existed in Venice at the time and Parma. And they were given access. When they were artists, other artists that were there would help them give access if it wasn't in the scuola or in a church. In 1595, the two brothers, Annibale and Agostino, traveled to Rome, called by the Farnese family to begin decorate the Camerino, which was a gallery in which the cardinal had some extraordinary, and I forgot to bring in the reproduction of it, but some extraordinary classical statues. So you had the niches in the place with the statues, including the Farnese Hercules, which is very broadly known, and is going to be actually reproduced in painting in the ceiling. So this is going to be an incredible work of art, mostly designed by Annibale, Agostino being there to help him paint, but it's got the whole idea is done, and it's how can I say, the composition is by Annibale, but the whole inspiration for the subject matter and guided by the librarian to the cardinal, who is going to define the kind of themes that are going to be used in the gallery. Is unfortunately going to get, and we don't know exactly what happened. Was it poisoning by lead again? Don't forget, these people were always in contact with very poisonous pigments. And so a lot of them got diseases or problems because of it. But he died in Rome in 1609 and asked to be buried in the Pantheon near Raphael, which actually happened. Raphael being the first artist being buried in the Pantheon. Before they came to Rome, they were asked then to decorate some room in the Palazzo Fava in Bologna. That is now the medieval civic museum, and what I'm showing you here is the works that they did above, not on the ceiling, because the ceiling is a coffered ceiling, but all about the kind of frieze that decorates each top of the rooms. And you can see already there something that that they're going to use in the Galleria Farnese with these Atlantis or thick sculptures that you see there. That's quite riportati, the idea of giving you trompe-l'œil sculptures. They're painted in grisaille to represent marble that surround these each scenes of love that surrounds the room. The three cousins painted in such similar way that sometimes it's almost impossible to define who painted what. So that when it's a separate altarpiece or whatever, they knew because they had contracts. But in the works where they, the three of them put their hands at it, it's impossible to differentiate who is who. Again, as I mentioned, the tremendous draftsmen, the three of them, and I just found, I didn't know this work, just found this one that I find extraordinary. So this is a study for the head of an old man. And I love these because they're very spontaneous for anybody that paints or whatever. You can see how they just paint, it's not quite finished, but you see the highlights on the face and so on. You can see the kind of white chalk that really gives the high. I find that head absolutely superb. And I sent it to a friend of mine who is a painter and who does a lot of portraits. And he said, "Is it yours?" I wish. I wish. But very stunning, I think, representative, very forceful. Here are a few works that they did, that Annibale did before being called to Rome. The Crucifixion here at the Santa Maria della Carità in Bologna. Oh, the baptism of Christ, and there we can see, I think, in that painting very much the influence of Correggio. That's why I gave you a painting by Correggio on the right that gives you that feel. Correggio has that tremendous atmosphere that in one hand he's been influenced by Leonardo da Vinci, but then it became his own. And he's a master of these very moody, atmospheric places. Very beautiful position of Christ, humbled by the fact he's baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. And then here you have almost a recollection of mannerism on the left, some position that you can find in Pontormo or Andrea del Sarto. We also can appreciate the landscape. Correggio started. Annibale, who is a very diverse type of painter, is going to touch all kinds of genres, and we'll see. And the next class is going to show. It was a great landscapist too, and so we can see in some of his work the beautiful landscape on the side. A large work is the Saint-Roch Givel-Ons. So you find it really busy. It's a very large painting that was supposed to be the counterpart for an existing painting in the oratory in, I think it was in Parma. And no, in Reggio Emilia. So in the Confraternity of San Rocco. And unfortunately, the place was destroyed. This is the only painting that was salvaged, but has been damaged. There's a big erosion you can see here, and other places you can see that the painting painting surface has been eroded. But very beautiful, and you can almost compare it to some of the Raphael work in the Vatican, the kind of dynamics that you find with him. Now, the work that Annibale particularly is the most known for was for the Farnese family. And I show you here the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, designed by Sangalo the Younger. This was a very prominent high Renaissance palace, and it currently houses, so that you know, the French embassy in Rome. If you want to visit it, you are allowed to visit, but you have to get an appointment, a special appointment to before you go there. This was at that time the most imposing palace in the 16th century. And Sangalo was one of Bramante's assistants. So what happened is, as I mentioned, there was a large gallery that needed to be decorated. And very interesting, this is the gallery. So imagine that ceiling completely, you know, monochrome. But then you had the niches with a beautiful collection of classical statues, very, very known, including the Hercules, the Farnese, what was called the Farnese Hercules. The style that they're going to use is very much what they call the Gran Manera. It's that dramatic style that is characterized by a close study of nature, of antiquity, and when we talk about that, it's Raphael and Michelangelo. Raphael for the very balanced composition, Michelangelo for the incredible study of anatomy and position in general. They're going to use what we call the quadratura, which is an illusionistic architectural painting, which means that all you see, these fake ribs and so on, it's all fake. It's not a solid marble or stucco or whatever. It is pure painting. This is a flat surface. So it's very much a trompe-l'oeil. And then they also use quadri portati, which is kind of framing of an easel painting. So you can see that each of the big scene is surrounded by a frame, as if it was a big canvas hanging at the wall. Annibale is going to work for 2 years together with Agostino on that, but then they're going to quarrel. And Agostino is going to leave and go back to Bologna, where he's going to help his cousin rule that new academy of theirs. But Annibale is going to make an enormous amount of studies to make sure the proper composition for each of that. And this is just an example of what he did. So you can see he does just the study for the frames. And then for each of the main paintings, he goes there and really works, starting with the architecture, and then he superimposes the drawing for the figures. And when you see here, you see right away the influence of Michelangelo. You can be sure he spent hours in the Sistine Chapel looking at what Michelangelo had done. And it's very difficult because this became almost as influential as the Sistine Chapel. That ceiling was admired by all contemporaries and for hundreds of years. Very, very influential, but really difficult to integrate all these shapes and forms in one sensible surface. And here's the main, this is the centerpiece of all these works. This is the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne. Definitely from the beginning, this was not going to be just a single scene. but as I say, different frames with different stories on it. This represents, it's actually at the base, inspired by a sarcophagus, classical sarcophagus. Actually, two scenes of that sarcophagus that were put together. But what it shows is the marriage of Bacchus and Ariadne. And for you that are working at the, that have worked or are still working at the Phoenix Art Museum, there is a painting by Gros showing Ariadne and Bacchus. And it's the, let's say, the event that in Phoenix, in the Phoenix Art Museum, just happens before the marriage. It's when they meet. So the story was that Ariadne was the daughter of Minos, the king of Crete. And Ariadne had facilitated when Theseus was coming from Attica as a kind of hostage to be offered to the Minotaur with other youngsters. Ariadne had fallen in love with him and gave him a bowl of thread so that when he was in the maze and was going to find the Minotaur, he could kill the Minotaur and get out of the maze thanks to that bowl of thread. He was thankful for what she did and had promised to take her away from the island of Crete and back to Attica. And then they stopped in Naxos, a little island on the way, and Ariadne fell asleep, and Theseus said, "Good, I'm on my way." And he left her asleep, and there poor Ariadne found herself alone, but thanks God, Bacchus was around, saw her, fell in love with her immediately, and married her. And this is what we see here. Is Bacchus with all his surrounders, the bacchantes and all his court with, you can see here the satyrs and that whole very boisterous and noisy crowd is around, and Ariadne is sitting there. And as you can see, a little cherub is putting a crown on her head, and that crown is the representation of the constellation of Ariadne. When he threw the crown in the air, it became the constellation of Ariadne. So this is the short story of Bacchus and Ariadne, just to explain. So here is a view of that sarcophagus, which was an inspiration for the work. Bernini, when he saw the work, expressed his assessment of Annibale, who he claimed had combined all that is good, fusing the grace and drawing of Raphael, the knowledge and anatomy of Michelangelo, the nobility and manner of Correggio, the color of Titian, and the invention of Giulio Romano in Mantegna. So this is exactly what I tell you. It's kind of a symbiosis of all the best of all these great artists. Some details of Bacchus there and her. It's amazing. When I see a work like that, it's always, how come they come to be able to compose all that and make it a happy whole. Portrayed also in the gallery are images and the stories of Polyphemus that sees Galata. There is the nymph of the story again. This is a mythological scene. You have Galata, he's a nymph. You can see she's around the dolphins who carry her around. And Polyphemus is that giant with normally only one eye. And he sees her and he falls in love with her. That scene is here at the very end, one end of the gallery. This is all part of its metamorphosis, by the way. So this is the happy side of that part of love. But on the other side of the thing, you see something that is not as nice, is Polyphemus, who becomes jealous of another man who is in love with Galata, and that Galata accepted as her lover, Acis. And he decides that he has to get rid of him, and he takes a boulder and he hits him with a boulder, and he's going to die. And when he dies, Galata transformed Acis as a river. And so it becomes a river in Sicily. Amazing, and this is of course quite inspired by the Hercules, the Farnese Hercules, the very broad and large Polyphemus. So imagine you're entering that gallery and you have all these marvelous statues, and then you look up and you have them almost coming to life in the paintings created by Carracci. No, I haven't. I wish, but I didn't know at the time that I had to make an appointment. And that's why I advise everybody, if you ever go to Rome, you have to go quite a bit ahead of time, at least 2 weeks, to get an appointment. Other love stories, the Venus and Anchises. You know the name of Anchises because he was the father of Ennius, but himself fell in love with Venus, and this is the whole interesting story of Ennius going back to a god. And don't forget that Ennius becomes a story all put together to make sure that the emperors, the Roman emperor, find their lineage all the way back to gods, to Venus. So Ennius is considered is one of the story of the foundation of Rome. So when Troy goes into flame, Ennius is going to carry his father and come with his little son all the way to Rome, and then found Rome. The story goes that Anchises wasn't very modest, and he started claiming everywhere that he was the lover of Aphrodite or Venus. And Zeus became very jealous of that kind of thing, and he hit him with a boulder, with a bolt of lightning, and made him lame. And this is the reason when they flee Troy, why Ennius has to carry him. See that this is mythology is very nasty. What you see them framed with, by the way, interesting again, these are pure paintings, but they mimic sculptures. These two are called differently. So the Herm is originally just like a post. It was like a column that they would put in the ground, had different use, including marking mileage along the road. But very quickly, instead of being just the column, it was the top became often human, very often representing Hermes, who is the god of the travelers. And showing Hermes there, but very often with a huge phallus in erection. Don't tell me why, but it's a protective feeling, apparently. The others that you see on either side of the frame, they are what is called Atlantis. And so they are total figures that carry often a ceiling or a cornice. And this becomes one of the very typical ornamentation that you find during the Baroque period. Mercury and Paris, of course, you know the story of Paris, that is given the duty of choosing the prettiest of the three goddesses, and he's given the golden apple by Hermes There, of course, we can see that spectacular foreshortening of Hermes coming down and giving the golden apple to Paris. But beside that great work in the Palazzo Farnese, he's Carracci, who was really celebrated, much more approachable man actually than Caravaggio was. But as I say, he was the continuation of the classicism that we had seen during the Renaissance, and that still for most people was considered the top type of art that you could find. And so he gets a lot of commission, and including the main piece, the altarpiece of the Cehasi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo. He gets that commission by Monsignore Tiberio Cehasi, and who was a very important lawman in the papal court. He had acquired the rights to the chapel in 1600 and then decided to decorate it. And it's really interesting to tell you how people react to it. Nowadays, when people go there, they barely look at the Carracci, but they look at the two Caravaggio on either side. And you have the martyrdom of St. Peter and the conversion of St. Paul on both sides. And it's really interesting because Caravaggio was forgotten for about a century and a half. But now it's just the opposite. People adore Caravaggio and mostly don't know Carracci anymore. At that time, Carracci was the top. Caravaggio was the newcomer. But Carracci was still imposing that marvelous classicism that they had found in the Renaissance. And this work is absolutely spectacular when you see the Assumption of the Virgin, and the very new representation of the Virgin, who seems to be coming out of the canvas. She has such an impetus of going up and out of her space. It is quite extraordinary. This is emphasized by the two figures there that are fallen on their back, surprised by what's happening. Don't forget, the Assumption was not yet, how can I say, certified dogma, if you want, but it was quite believed at that time and pushed by the church that the Virgin had not died, but had gone to heaven as a human being. Now, compare that with the work that Caravaggio had done at about just a few years later, and see why this was refused by the Discalced Carmelite that had commissioned the work. Supposed to be the same time, but Caravaggio shows the Virgin is dead. And this is why it was refused by the Discalced Carmelite. What they wanted was something showing the Virgin in glory, but in their mission just before going into being elevated to the heavens. So a very different feel, if you want, where a very human side of the Virgin there, whereas on the other side, it's her very, very much mystical side. A few other works by Carracci, that beautiful Domine Quo Vadis. This is that part of the legends of Ariadne that shows Peter crossing Christ, carrying the cross, and Peter asking Christ, "Where are you going, sir?" And not even recognizing God. And then God tells him that to Rome to be crucified anew. And this is in fact kind of premise to what's going to happen to Peter, the fact he's going to be crucified too. Very beautiful, again, in the perspective is quite remarkable, but you see the beautiful landscape in the back, typical of Carracci. another Pietà with St. Francis and Mary Magdalene and Mary, of course. And then a much smaller work, this work that has been doubted, but now people come back with the idea it has to be by Carracci. It's a small triptych that is made both of oil on copper and on panel. And we're going to talk about the idea of copper. So we have two saints, St. Michael on the left, and probably Gabriel on the right. And then you open this and you have that lovely triptych. So this is what you call one of these private altarpieces. This was to put in a small room for meditating, for praying. It was, it belonged to the Cardinal Odoardo Farnese and was part of his inventory in 1619. A much smaller piece, but very, very handsome. And this brings us to the idea, why using copper? Carracci is one of the first one who is really going to use copper. And it is from there that the new support is going to gain popularity. Popularity is going to go north, and particularly at the court of Rudolf II of Austria. So let's quickly see why were they using copper. They were in search for new supports, and they tried marble, they tried alabaster, slate, silver, all kind of different things. But think about the time. This is mid-16th century. What had become popular were engraving on copper. So they knew they could find copper that was already prepared to be engraved, but why not trying to paint on it? Why did they need a new support? They had originally frescoes, but you couldn't carry frescoes. They had panels. Okay, panel is wood. As you know, when you have a board, the cutting board or whatever, it's going to vary depending on the heat and the humidity. When a surface like that changes even a few millimeters, you know, it contracts or dilates because of the heat or the humidity. The pigment that is on top has to suddenly stretch or come back. It doesn't do that, not easily. And so what happens is that you get the crackles. You get all these little cracks in between. The canvas was nice, but it was so flexible that for transport, often paintings that were carried on ships and so on for quite a while were going through storms, so they had different humidity, percentage of humidity and so on. These paintings would arrive in terrible condition at destination and had to be really heavily restored. So they looked for something that was more permanent and was easier to transport. Particularly, don't forget, they export to the New World, long trips. So this is why they look for it. So there is quite an improvement in mining copper in the technology. Therefore, it becomes cheaper. You have increased availability and reduced cost. There is a change in general for a smaller painting to go towards cabinet paintings for Kunstkammers. Kunstkammers are these little rooms where you hang small painting, and you also had collections that were displayed. And these cabinet paintings could be looked at really close, much closer than when you have a very large painting. The surface is also much smoother than other supports. You don't have to make such a heavy preparation. The only thing you have, as you know, you put some liquid on copper, it's going to stay as a bubble. So the way they had to do, they had to prepare typically, and they think that's probably one of the things, they would just rub garlic on the surface, and then it becomes sticky, and the pigment could adhere to the surface. What also happened because of the natural brilliance of the copper, that light comes through, you don't even realize, but it makes these paintings very brilliant because of that. And also sometimes for small paintings like miniatures, it was easier to cut in circle than having a board when you try to cut a piece of wood to come that way, or canvas then being stretched is very difficult. The copper was ideal. Easy to transport to Central and South America, performs much better in climatic change. There is a dilation and a contraction when you change temperature and humidity, but it's the same rate as the pigment. Therefore, it's perfect for these type of things. So extremely durable. The only problem you can have is if you bend it, you can't catch it back. So it has to remain really flat. And Bologna becomes the center for copper paintings, and it's going to go from there to the North Country, and particularly to Rudolph II in Prague. We'll talk about it more at length when we talk about northern paintings, because it's going to become one of their favorite surface in the 17th century. Annibale, as I mentioned, is quite eclectic. He does all kinds of paintings. He does religious painting, great demand, but for his own pleasure, he often does these type of genre painting. This is very much a specialty of the North. We've seen all the Campis and so on are painters that are specializing in genre painting. And this is just really cute. It's showing they are teasing the cat with the crayfish. And he's holding the crayfish, is going to pinch the ear of the cat. Now expect the reaction of the cat. What is he going to do? It's wow! And you're going to have the reaction where both kids are going to be scratched. Or here, the bean eater. And this is, again, we are in the north of Italy. So the influence between the northern painter, the Flemish painters, and the northern Italian painters is very noticeable. Particularly with this kind of painting, the butcher shop, that is a direct reflection. It's really nice actually to see how he treats that white on white. But it's a direct, it's inspired directly from Hyacinth, who is that northern painter. Hyacinth and his nephew Berkelard made this type of butcher store. But with the difference is very often they have in the back some stories that are biblical stories, kind of in the background, which is interesting, a reversal of what you normally see. Annibale was also known for being one of the early caricaturists. He apparently loved to doodle. It must have been, a busybody. So we find many plates showing caricatures of all kinds. And these were relaxing moments for these artists, is to really look at people, and they emphasize the funny part of the face or the character. And we know that Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of caricature too, by the way, but this is very known for Carracci. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the last slide on it, but we now have 2 weeks rest, and then I'll see you again in November. You have at the back of your little flyer, you have the dates. We start with the Carracci and landscapes. We'll see the landscapes at that period of time. And then on the Thursday that follows, we're going to talk about the end of neoclassicism in France. So let me, if you could put the light on, that would be really nice. No, it's okay. It's